Welcome to the Oil Minute, creating unlimited value in the oil patch. This is episode 18. I'm Zachary Rogers. We'll be talking about pipeline fake news today. So let's go through the Colonial Pipeline shutdown. So, the Colonial Pipeline, what actually happened? What would you expect to happen on the economic side when a pipeline such as the Colonial Pipeline goes out? So here's how you have to analyze it. You have to analyze it from the actual regions. So let's take the two kind of the beginning and the end of the Colonial Pipeline. So it starts basically in Houston and it ends in the New York market. It ends in New Jersey technically, but we'll just say New York. So what would happen when you have a pipeline go out like that is that if it was a major issue for the market, what you would see is that on the end of the pipeline, the market that actually really cares about the supply going into the pipeline to feed their demand, you would expect that market, that price would spike to incentivize other importers to send barrels into the region. So what you would expect is that the New York price of gasoline and diesel, for example, would spike enough so that it became economic for other suppliers such as Europe to send barrels over across the Atlantic into New York to open up that New York Rotterdam spread, or the arbitrage, if you will. So you would expect that that spread would spike, New York prices would spike. That's what you would expect, but we didn't see that happen necessarily. So that is pretty curious. And then on the Houston side, at the beginning of the pipeline, the people in Houston don't consume any. People in Houston and the Gulf Coast necessarily in that region don't consume any fuel that's sent on that pipeline because it's basically serving Pad 1, the southeast, as well as the East Coast. What you would expect is that the refiners there, the market has the opposite issue where they have a buildup of product of gasoline, diesel, jet fuel. When that happens, refiners only have a certain amount of choices. They can either say, hey, we can't send our product into this pipeline, so we're going to have to try to send it into the export market, and you do that through discounting your price to clear it to another lower value market. Or you say, hey, we're going to build up product stocks, which is not necessarily great because it's just going to destroy the value of product in your market. Or you can say, hey, we're going to idle our refinery, we're going to reduce our run rates, we're going to reduce our CDU utilization. And that is logical. The problem that refiners have, though, is that you can't necessarily start up a refinery very quickly. If you turn off a CDU or you reduce it, you can't just flip it back on. It takes a lot of time. So there's a time cost to that. So it's a very complicated equation for refiners to figure out. But ultimately, we really didn't see that happen. We saw a bunch of news stories on CNN and all these other places saying how there were shortages of gas and gasoline in the stations across the southeast and the east coast. Now, while that's true, the wholesale market really didn't care. So what that tells me is to say, well, this wasn't necessarily a problem from the perspective of the wholesale market. It was a problem of getting gasoline from the terminals, which are racks, which are just a fancy word for places that you store gasoline in the wholesale market, and then trucks come and lift it from those terminals, and then they drive it to the street level gas stations where people pick up their gasoline. So this kind of goes to show how the wholesale market and the U.S. refiners are extremely disconnected from the street price. Refiners do not care about the street price of gasoline. The street price of gasoline is not determined by these things. It's determined by the oil market. The largest factor for gasoline prices in the United States on the street level is oil price. So refiners can have an amazing gasoline market that in low oil prices, they can have a terrible gasoline market in high oil prices. All they care about is that crack spread between gasoline and oil. So what really happened with the Colonial Pipeline is that there's about 2 million barrels a day that flows through it, and you can't just simply replace that by rail and trucks to lift it from the rack to the street. It's almost impossible on the logistics issue. So the fake news basically comes in here because then they say, hey, this demonstrates that we need the Keystone XL pipeline, or we need DAPL, or all these things. And while I personally support the development of Keystone XL, and I support obviously DAPL, even though it's already existing, it's already running, it's a completely different issue. So crude pipelines and product pipelines are not the same thing, obviously. The one difference between crude pipelines and product pipelines is that there's really only a few customers for a crude pipeline. Consumers don't use crude oil, they use refined products. The people that actually use crude oil are refineries, and there's a very small amount of refineries in comparison to gas stations in the US. So A crude pipeline going out isn't necessarily the worst thing in the world because you can have, rail backfill that because you're just trying to get it to one market. You're just trying to get it to the refining center. You're not trying to distribute that oil across the entire country on hyperly small markets, to one gas station, to one small town. That doesn't need to happen on the crude side. So there's more flexibility when crude pipelines go out. Of course, people would prefer pipelines depending on what side of the coin you are. But again, comparing product pipelines and crude pipelines is just illogical, and it's not a very good argument. And then it goes into this whole discussion about, Keystone XL, Nord Stream 2. So, we have to get back into this discussion about Nord Stream 2 and Keystone XL. So, some people are criticizing the Biden administration for, canceling the permit for Keystone XL. But then at the same time, I guess they eased off sanctions on some actors that are involved in the development of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. So, personally for me, I think both should go through, but we have to look at the incentives of this. It's not very simple. So, Keystone XL, is it important for the United States? Not really, in my opinion. The only people that really benefit in the United States from Keystone XL are complex Midwestern refiners, or it's basically it. Keystone XL, all it really does is it adds value to Western Canadian crude prices. So if you're somebody in Alberta, Canada, who's producing heavy crude, and you want to fetch a higher netback, which is the fancy word for saying the price that you receive for your oil at the wellhead, then you want a cheapest cost of transportation possible. So you prefer a pipeline to rail, or at worst case truck, or even worse than that, just build up stocks in your region. So this is why Canada and Alberta especially is all about the development of the Keystone XL pipeline. It has no effect at all at U.S. gasoline prices, or for U.S. gasoline prices. What it really does is it basically just adds flexibility for refiners across the United States, especially in the Gulf Coast, to source heavy crude. The refiners in the Gulf Coast are configured to run heavy crude. Legacy-wise, we would import a lot from the Middle East, which skews very heavy crude, and we would run that in the Gulf Coast. And Canada has heavy crude, so they're developing a way to get that down cheaply into the United States. What a lot of people don't realize is that even if the Keystone XL pipeline is canceled or it never is built, the same amount of oil basically from Canada will still make its way down to the U.S. Gulf Coast. It will just come through alternate mechanisms of transportation, such as rail. So it has no effect on gasoline prices. Again, that's going to be determined by the oil price at the time. So anybody who's saying that Keystone XL being canceled is going to spike gasoline prices either is ignorant or they have an agenda. It's just not true. And then on the Nord Stream 2 side, again, I'm finding it a bit confusing as to why the U.S. is so opposed to this. I do understand the geopolitics of let's make Russia, let's make their lives harder by, not allowing them to sell natural gas into Germany. But it's all about the incentives, right? If I was Germany, I would want Nord Stream 2 to be built, and I would also want the United States to help me build regasification plants to import U.S. LNG into my market. I want as much supply diversification as I can so that I can buy whoever's gas based off of price at that time. If you were the U.S., I guess you don't necessarily want Nord Stream 2 built for geopolitical reasons, but again, the only way that you're going to replace Russian gas into Europe is by helping the Germans build out infrastructure to import U.S. LNG, which is not a cheap undertaking. It's not just a liquid, it's a gas. You have to take natural gas from the United States, you have to liquefy it, hence LNG, which is very expensive, put it on very expensive carriers, LNG tankers, ship it over to Germany, and then at that point in time in the ports over there, they have to regasify it. And then put it on pipelines and put it into their distribution system. So Nord Stream 2 is not the same thing as Keystone XL. It's not the same thing as Colonial. Again, you always just have to look at the incentives of these certain actors on the pipelines. Germany benefits from Nord Stream 2. They do. They also would benefit from the ability to import U.S. LNG, although without assistance from the United States, I don't see what their incentive is to build in gasification plants to accommodate the American government's wishes. And then Keystone XL just has no effect whatsoever on gas prices. So watch out for that, because anybody who says that is either ignorant or they have an agenda. It's absolutely not true fundamentally. And then on the Colonial Pipeline, it wasn't necessarily a big deal for the market. It was just the logistics of getting gasoline from the terminals, which are called racks, to the street. And trucks simply cannot replace the volume that a pipeline has. So the solutions that the Southeast would have going forward are to either build out a refinery, which the economics might not support, or alternate supply, something, maybe try to build in ports to import more from Europe, because we have the Jones Act, which basically makes it extremely expensive for U.S. ships to ship gasoline and product from one U.S. port to another U.S. port. So unless the Jones Act is repealed, the Southeast especially will be extremely vulnerable to the Colonial Pipeline outage. So the big thing to watch really is if the cybersecurity improves, which that'll be interesting to see. But until then, just keep your eye out for pipeline fake news. It's all about incentives. And again, Keystone XL has no effect on gasoline prices. I'm Zachary Rogers, and this has been the Oil Minute.